Hello. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about some pressing issues within health and general martial arts community. So the idea of knee problems and what can cause them basically is what I'm going to be going over here. So this video was spurred on by a private student of mine and that has been having some knee problems. So I thought I'd make this video public so that everyone could benefit. So before we begin, make sure that you use this as a supplement, not as a replacement for any kind of doctoral care or any physical therapy that you might be doing. This is not meant to replace it, but meant to supplement it, as well as meant to help you in the future to prevent knee problems and injuries. So without any further ado, let's begin. So the first major way that people tend to have knee problems, especially in the martial arts community, is the alignment of their knees. So if I just have my leg like so, you can see that my knee is above my toe. Now, in many different positions, there will be context as to what that means, but in a position like this, it's very much directly above the toe like so. So if I were to say, bend my knee inwards like this, you can see that now there's like a bend to my leg, an angle there, as well as if I go like this, now there's an angle like so. Both of those are incorrect and called wobbly knees, which is one of the mistakes that we talk about in Tai Chi. In Tai Chi, we want to talk about getting the knee in line with the foot. So basically, what this means is when my knee is out of position like this or like this, the weight of my body, which normally is trying to transfer down through the feet, is getting stuck there. You can think of it like a wire that's not quite touching each other, right? So you get the wire and the charge will jump to the other wire, but it uses up some energy in order to get from here to here. So it's not going to have as much charge as it would have if the wire was connected. In the same way, when the weight transfers down through the body, you want the wire to be touching. In this case, the knee to be aligned. Because anywhere where there's like a hiccup or like a bend, it's going to tear down on the knees. Essentially, the knee is supposed to be a weight transference joint, which means it transfers the weight directly through and it never stops at the knee. But when you take your knee out of alignment, it becomes a weight bearing joint, where now some of the weight is bearing down on the knee and not transferring through to the ground properly, which means that it's going to be bearing down on your knees over time, and doing that enough will cause problems with the knees and injuries. This particular fix helped me with my own knee problems, because I had bad knee problems when I was working jobs at factories and warehouses, a lot of like repetitive movement, a lot of heavy lifting kind of stuff, and I really had bad knee problems at the time. I was like 20 to 24 at the time, so like bad knee problems for someone who's young, it's going to be only worse for someone who's older, right? So it's best to get to these fixes early. So actually when I got this fix it in my martial arts, and I started to incorporate that into my daily life, my knee problems went away. I don't have knee problems anymore. So I highly recommend getting this fix. So making sure that the knee is aligned properly. So if I stand in like what's called Wuji posture, or the feet shoulder width, if you watch my legs, both of my feet are pointed forward, so pointed directly at the camera, and now my knees are also pointed forward. So my knees should not be in or out like this, nor should I have my feet, say, are pointed the opposite way, while you see my knees are pointed forward. This is actually, I've witnessed in like several people who've had bad posture over time, and their skeletal structure kind of becomes that over time, like kind of becomes their natural state, and then when they try to fix it, it becomes very difficult. But they have this problem, and they have knee problems and ankle problems. So we want to try and get that to be fixed and to have them over the toes like so. So when doing movements like this, say my movement is to turn to the right, like say if I'm like doing black tiger punches like this, right? Or reverse punches in other arts it's called. So if you pay attention to my knees, as I turn my waist, you see that one side of my hips pulls the knee backwards while the other pushes the other knee forward. Because my hips do this, right? And it pushes one while it pulls the other. So equal and opposite reactions and all that. But as you notice, they only go forward and back over my toes. What is a common mistake, and I have to fix this in every single one of my students or anyone who comes to my class, is that when they start to turn, they do this. They can see my knees coming in and out like this, which for someone who's untrained, this feels more natural than this, because this opens the quad more, opens the ligaments here, which is very unnatural to someone who's untrained. But that's, again, tearing the knees over time, so we don't want to do that. So we want to treat the knees like they're on tracks. So as I turn, like it's on a track in line with my foot, my knee can only move in this direction, and same with this knee. If I want to turn my knee another direction, I have to turn my whole leg. So now you see my leg is facing that way. My knee, my ankle, my hip is all faced that way. But if I only turn my hip and my knee and I leave my ankle, that's going to be a problem. Same way, if I only turn my foot and my knee is still facing forward and my hip's still facing forward, it's going to be a problem. Basically, the fix for this is to make sure that you maintain this relationship between the hip, knee, and ankle. So whenever doing any kind of pivot, instead of pivot from your ankle, which often lags behind with the knee and hip, right? Think, move the hip itself and let the whole leg rotate with it. So moving from the root of the leg, the root being the root that touches the torso. If the torso is considered the earth, this is the root of the tree that is growing. So we rotate the whole leg in or out. So this makes sure that we maintain that hip alignment no matter what we're doing. Now, postures where it might look incorrect, if we take like a snake stance posture like this, obviously my knee is not directly over my leg, right? The idea is that it's still aligned. So my foot is facing that way, my knee is also facing that way, and so is my hip. If I were doing something like this, where now my knee is facing that way, and my foot is facing that way, that would be incorrect. So it's all context-based as to how that works. And believe me, your body will tell you when you're doing it wrong. So make sure that this is all aligned. And also make sure to not mistake discomfort for actual like searing pain kind of thing. Because physical discomfort is not quite the same thing as like the discomfort that you get from pain of doing it wrong. It could just be soreness because your body's not used to it, which is typical when new students are starting out. So now moving on from that one, another common issue that people have when they have knee problems is that they have very tense knees, or specifically the musculature around the knees is very tense. It's kind of locking it in place. We talk about in martial arts trying to relax all the time, right? The more tense we are, the more it inhibits movement. Tension is the idea of holding a muscle in place, like holding its strength, but it's actually not strength. It's just holding tension there, which inhibits motion. And I like to talk about this as the difference between tension and engagement. Engagement is the active flow and contraction, stretching of the muscles, whereas tension is like I hold my muscles and I hold my tightness. So tension is the mistake. We don't want to be tense. We want to allow engagement, and tension does not allow for engagement because the muscle's already busy doing the tension thing. So basically what this means for joints, if I have tense quads, tense hamstrings, tense shin, if I try to move my joints, essentially my joint is trying to move, but the muscles around it are tight, so it's going to have a very hard time moving, or at the very least it's going to have a restricted time moving. And having this done a lot over time is essentially going to wear out the knee. You can think about the knee as like a lubricated joint, and doing this tension is like causing everything to rust. So that's an analogy for it. But essentially we want to try and relax the musculature that doesn't need to engage. So if we stand up, we only need to stand up with a certain amount of musculature, right? We don't need to tense our whole body just to stand up. It's ridiculous. We don't need that much. So we want to try and find that space where we are only finding the amount of tension that is required to stand, which is actually the engagement required to stand. So that when we're doing our walking, again, we're not tight-legged moving around. We want to relax and only engage the muscle groups that we need to. So we can free up the other muscles to do other work, as well as not cause problems for the knees. So tension is another issue to look out for. Another thing to look out for is musculature imbalance. So if I use my arm as an example, everybody knows their bicep and their tricep, right? So basically, the idea of like the counter muscles, so bicep does this while tricep does this, right? So they are antithesis to each other. Antithesis, blah. So when one contracts, the other stretches, and when this one contracts, this one stretches. Now what happens is when we like work out a lot, the muscles actually shorten. This is because it's like compressing and getting stronger, right? So if I do that with just one of these muscles, so if I say I really work out my biceps, but I neglect my triceps. So I really work my biceps really hard. The muscle here is getting shorter and shorter and tighter, while this one is still weak. So what this means is that this muscle, can't talk today. This muscle, which is getting shorter, is now pulling more and more on this joint. But this muscle isn't pulling to counteract that. So the shorter this gets, the more it pulls on the joint, which means it's going to be pulling it unevenly. If we were training them equally, they would equally be pulling on the joint, which means that it's not going to go cockeyed. But if I only pull one, you can see it will turn the joint, or not turn the joint, but you know what I'm trying to say. The joint will be pulled more in one direction than the other. This will also cause joint issues. So in this case, it'd be the elbow. In the knees case, it has to do with the thigh and the shin as well. So when we do our normal walking, we think, well, we don't think, but typically we push out of our back step as we're doing our daily walk. So it's like I push out to go forward, right? So this activates a lot of the outer thigh here. A muscle group that rarely gets used by a common practice, as well as it's kind of rare in martial arts as well, depending on what martial art you're training, is this inner thigh here. So the inner thigh here will do the opposite. So when we think push out, we're activating the inner thigh. So naturally, what's the opposite of push? Pull. So if I think pull, I'll activate the inner thigh. This can also be done by thinking instead of push out, I think pull in, right? Exercises like this, it activates the inner thigh to pull, as well as we can use it as like a walk. So if I think instead of push out of my back foot, I think anchor and pull with my front foot, it's going to activate the inner thigh. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, again, muscle imbalances, if this gets overdeveloped and this gets underdeveloped, it's going to be pulling more like this, so my knee is going to be pulled out of joint, and that's no good. So we want to try and alleviate that. So exercises like pulling into your front foot as you walk, or exercises like this where you're pulling inwards, are ways to alleviate that problem for muscle imbalances. This one I also used to help some students who had knee problems, and they told me that they had improved over time and that it was really helping them. So I want to make sure I get that on video here. Now we move on to the problems that can happen with overtraining. Everybody needs to rest. Everybody should rest, especially when you fully injure yourself, and that's like too far. Now you really need to rest. Always make sure that you have time for rest, because overworking yourself is just as bad as underworking yourself, because you're just going to tear yourself apart, and then you need to rest, and then you aren't training for those days, right? So some typical ways of overtraining, like a hyperextension. Basically, when people, like if I take kicking as an example, when people are practicing their kicks, right? Typically beginners will be like, okay, I need to kick really hard, really fast, right off the bat, right? Some might slow down at the beginning, but others might think, oh, I just gotta go fast, just gotta go. This is a way that you can really wreck yourself. Basically, if the tendons and ligaments are not strengthened enough to handle the work that you're doing, you're gonna tear them, and it's gonna be bad. And so when practicing these, it's good to really go slow at first and then speed up over time, ramping it up a little by little so you can develop those tendons so they can handle the work. And typically as well, hyperextension is a problem, because if I am doing all this when I don't have trained musculature to handle this, I'm gonna cause myself a problem. If I'm saying practicing snap kicks, which is like this kind of thing, right? Where I'm snapping upwards. If I just go full blown right away, all this work here is causing problem for the tendon. So all that coming up and that locking the knee and hyperextending the joints gonna cause really big problems. We want to be careful for that. When we're trained and we have the strength and bodies to do so, we can do things more vigorously, but not too early. Especially, say if I'm doing a punch, when I do a punch, I never hyperextend the joint, because this will cause problems. In martial arts, we'll say that's a broken arm. If someone catches it, broke. Also, you can cause yourself hyperextension injuries. So no matter how far I extend, there will always be even a slight bend. So some people say shorter bend or a smaller bend or a bigger bend than others, while others will look like they're going straight, but there's still a small bend. You always want to have that bend. You don't want to go lock your arm or lock your leg, because that will cause problems. Another thing, which kind of goes on to the whole knee alignment thing that I talked about earlier, meniscus tearing, which is a common thing that happens whenever like we twist the joint too quickly or too erratically. It's basically like a shock absorber for your knee joint, which is between the shin bone and the thigh bone. So going back to the whole knee alignment thing, this whole out of balance or out of alignment thing here, if I do this like really fast, it's essentially gonna tear the meniscus, tear all the ligaments and tendons. And that's another danger of doing this. Not only just in like slow practices, but also like fast practices where we're practicing for power or speed. There's even more danger for that. So we want to make sure that we take care of ourselves by not overdoing it. Always train slow and then ramp it up over time so you don't hurt yourself, as well as taking in mind the corrections to make sure this doesn't happen. The more that your knees are in alignment, the easier it's going to be for your joints. So it's the same thing in kicking as in standing. If I kick with my knee in one way and my ankle on the other, even in the air, but especially if I'm hitting a target, it's the same as standing, right? If I stand incorrectly, it's bad. If I kick incorrectly, it's also bad. If I have to kick with my leg to the side like this, I can't do it with my knee facing you. I have to turn my whole hip. So it's dangerous to just make sure that your knee is aligned, make sure that you're being smart about your training, not overdoing things, and always pay attention and listen to your doctors and medical advice and all that. So I wanted to make this lesson like free and available to everybody so it could help and supplement their training and hopefully help them prevent knee problems in the future, as well as to aid any physical therapy that people might be doing. Listen to your doctors, and I hope this also helps. Take care.